In a pivotal speech on January 17, 2017, UK Prime Minister Theresa May outlined her strategy for the nation's exit from the European Union. Until now, Ms. May had disclosed little to no details on how she would approach Brexit, given the wide array of options ranging from staying in the European single market and continuing to allow free movement of labor and goods, to totally exiting the trade region and taking complete autonomy of trade and immigration. In her speech, the Prime Minister dictated that she would pursue the latter, known as a hard Brexit. So what are the greater implications of a complete break from the EU? Economically, the UK is highly dependent on the EU, which makes a hard Brexit widely seen as the riskier approach to the divorce. In terms of trade, 44% of UK exports go to the EU, while 53% of UK imports come from the EU. This means that essentially half of all UK trade currently goes through the European single market. On the other hand, the proportion of EU exports to the UK compared to all other non-EU nations is only 17%. While the UK is the single largest importer of EU goods and services, the UK undoubtedly benefits more from the relationship than the EU as a whole. What this means is that the UK will need to aggressively pursue a free trade agreement with the European Union in order to avoid serious damage to their economy, but will not find it easy to do so since the two are in some ways at odds with each other. Europeans have few incentives to make it easier for the UK and are more likely to make tough demands to set a precedent that remaining inside the EU is more beneficial than leaving it in order to strengthen the Union in the long run and discourage other skeptical members from pursuing their own exits. Without a free trade agreement finalized before the 2-year deadline, trade between the UK and the EU after Brexit would fall under the rules of the World Trade Organization. This would result in the EU imposing whatever tariffs and trade barriers it currently has with the rest of the world on the UK and vice versa. However, trade agreements tend to take many years of negotiation, and completing one from start to finish in 2 years would be unprecedented. For example, negotiations for Canada's free trade agreement with the EU, known as the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, began in 2009 and was only signed and ratified in October of 2016, 7 years later. Failure to complete negotiations within the 2-year timeline could be disastrous for parts of the UK economy. Many sectors which rely heavily on exports to the EU may suddenly find themselves unable to compete with the rest of Europe due to the new tariffs under WTO rules. The UK food industry would be hit especially hard. According to a Scottish newspaper, approximately 80% of Scotland's €1 billion food exports go to EU countries. If no trade agreement is reached, these exports would be devastated by high food tariffs while still needing to comply with the EU's notoriously strict food regulations. Another big issue that comes with a hard Brexit is that of immigration and foreign workers. The desire for tighter controls on immigration was one of, if not the biggest drivers of Brexit. In her speech, the Prime Minister was assertive that by no longer complying with the free movement of labor enforced by the EU, she can and would pursue more restrictive immigration laws to bring down what much of the British public perceives to be an excessively large immigrant population. However, many sectors of the UK economy currently employ large proportions of workers from the EU who will need to be addressed in order to avoid wide-scale loss of manpower. According to the UK Office of National Statistics, there are currently around 2.3 million EU nationals working in the UK and comprise of approximately 7% of the workforce. Although Ms. May did not outline her plan to deal with EU workers post-Brexit, it is likely that they will be granted the right to remain after the exit in order to minimize the disruption to the economy and appease both human rights groups and other European leaders. However, even with current EU nationals staying, there are questions as to how a declining flow of migrants will affect parts of the economy which depend on them. Some possible outcomes are that this will decrease domestic unemployment by encouraging businesses to hire more local workers, or force companies to be more efficient by producing the same amount of value with less manpower and greater automation. On the other hand, it's also possible that the loss in migrant labor will not be replaceable, and sectors that rely heavily on them will either contract or begin relocating back to other EU countries. Concerns over these issues have been brought up by the British Parliament, with many members having already formed an opposition in reaction to the plan outlined in the Prime Minister's speech. On January 24th, the Supreme Court released a ruling that requires the government's Brexit strategy to be approved by Parliament before formally triggering Article 50. This gives leverage to the conglomerate of Liberal and pro-Euro MPs who, while highly unlikely to try to stop the Brexit process, will want to use their power to negotiate a less extreme approach. Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has also voiced her disapproval of the hard Brexit approach and has suggested that Scotland may even put forth a second referendum on independence from the United Kingdom. For now, the self-imposed timeline of triggering Article 50 and formally beginning the UK's exit from the European Union is set for March of 2017. If all goes to plan, 2019 will see an EU without its second largest economy. What remains to be seen is whether the United Kingdom will come off better or worse from the split, and how it will affect the very survival of the European Union itself. But that's just my 2 cents.